The next talk is by Žiga Krajnik from NYU, and he'll talk about anomalous fluctuations in cellular automata and spin chains.
Can you hear me well? Yeah, so I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present some of my work. And well, I mean, some of these you've already heard yesterday in the talk of Jacopo, so I will hopefully try to focus more on the sort of microscopic approach and not say very much about the hydrodynamics. Okay, so I mean, I'm talking about fluctuations. I mean, there is this sort of very simple toy model that's very useful to just understand the basic idea. And that is just a sequence of coin tosses through the Bernoulli process. Now, of course, I mean, for a coin toss, it's a sort of a very simple calculation to know exactly what the distribution of that process is. But what's more interesting is if you ask about some asymptotic properties of that distribution. And the most basic thing you can ask is if I repeat this coin toss a large number of times, then essentially the law of large numbers tell you that your sample mean will actually go to the distribution mean. Of course, I mean, in an actual given realization, you will not hit exactly the mean. There will be some fluctuation around that value. And essentially, the center limit theorem then tells you that your typical fluctuation is going to be of order square root of n, and the distribution of that is going to be Gaussian around the mean value. And then another question that you can ask is, how likely is it that you will go very far away from the mean? That's what's called a large fluctuation. And here, you have what's called a large deviation principle. And what that tells you essentially is that you're exponentially unlikely in the number of coin tosses to go very far away from the mean, and the rate of this exponential suppression is given by what's called a rate function. Now, one important thing is the rate function is distinct from just naively extrapolating the center limit result. In particular, if you were to just extrapolate the center limit result, you would have that the rate function is a parabola. And this is plotted here in orange. But if you actually do the computation, you find that this is not a parabola. It's some function. The exact shape does not matter so very much. But there is nevertheless some relation between these two ideas. And that is, if you look at the rate function, and then you can do a Taylor expansion around the mean value. Now, the rate function at the origin is going to be 0 because the mean value is not exponentially suppressed. Then because that's a local minimum, the first derivative is also going to be 0. So that generically you have a quadratic expansion. And then if you go back to rescale to the typical scale, you will essentially recover the center limit theorem, where the variance is going to be given by the curvature of the rate function at the origin. Okay, so I mean, this is just some very basic ideas about fluctuations. Now, essentially what I'd like to do is to ask the same type of questions in a many-body system. And in particular, I will sort of talk about integrable systems. I mean, we've heard they have a large number of conserved quantities, but so this is just an example of how this is manifested. So in particular, you have solitons. What I show here is the time evolution of some Gaussian bump in an integrable spin chain. And now you see that instead of sort of just spreading out, you actually find solitons that start shooting out. So they're ballistically propagating particles. And these solitons sort of they behave as if there were free particles that just go along straight lines, except, for example, here where they meet, they scatter elastically, but there is some phase shift associated with that. But that's sort of the basic phenomenology of an integrable model. So now, okay, so the first question about mean value dynamics, that's essentially a hydrodynamic theory. And well, what's the idea? That if you look at quantities that are not conserved, those will relax very rapidly to their equilibrium values, whereas the conserved quantities, they will relax slowly and they will obey a local continuity equation. So then the idea of how you can build up your hydrodynamic description is you say that, okay, I mean, if I take a small local subsystem, then locally that will very rapidly equilibrate to an equilibrium state in an integrable system that is a GGE. And then what you do is you do a space-time modulation of the parameters that govern that GGE, and this essentially gets your hydrodynamic theory. So for integrable systems, this was done some 10 years ago by two groups, and sort of the central object there is what's known as the flux Jacobian, and using this sort of quasi-particle picture of scattering between quasi-particles, you can actually quantify this flux Jacobian, and this essentially gets you what's now called as generalized hydrodynamics. I mean, many of the people who are sort of instrumental in this project are parts of this workshop, so I don't really have very much to say beyond that. I'll just say that the program has been very successful, and it also gave the first quantitative description of what's known as the quantum Newton's cradle experiment, which at the time it was performed, there was no theoretical explanation, but now this you can get essentially a quantitative match between experiments and the theory. Okay, so that's about mean values. Now I want to talk about fluctuations. And I mean, how can you study fluctuations in a many-body system? There is a sort of very simple thing that you can do, and that is you just sit at some point of your system, and then you count how much charge passes across this point up to some time t. So you just look at the integrated current. And you can think of this as essentially some sum of correlated coin tosses, because the current value at each time depends on your initial conditions. But of course, the important difference is that the currents at different values of time are now correlated because of processes in the system. And well, I mean, this problem has been studied in numerous contexts. Perhaps the most well-developed is this macroscopic fluctuation theory by the Rome group, which applies to diffusive systems. And essentially, they tell you will have a large deviation principle for a diffusive system, and there is a set of equations that you get by maximizing a certain functional to solve for the rate function. And a similar idea has also been essentially extending, combining ideas of generalized hydrodynamics and this macroscopic fluctuation theory, and then combining this ballistic macroscopic fluctuation theory. And the central object in the study of fluctuations is what's known as the full counting statistics, or if you want, the moment generating function of your process. And one difference that I would like to point out, I mean, here in the macroscopic fluctuation theory, you essentially look at deviations from Fick's law, and then you weigh this appropriately. Whereas in ballistic macroscopic fluctuation theory, you do not have a Fick's law. You essentially just you have just this system of conservation equations on the hydrodynamic scale. Now, once you have these two results, I mean, you have essentially have a statement, you will have a large deviation principle, and there is even a set of equations to solve for the rate function. But then, of course, I mean, even though I cannot directly apply the central limit theorem to this because the values are correlated, I could ask, I mean, I can still do a similar type of argument in that the rate function will generically be quadratic near the origin, so I just expand it, and then I would expect typical fluctuations to be generically Gaussian. But there is a problem in that, and that is that, you see, when you take the rate function, you already took the limit of t to infinity. So then when you try to rescale back to the typical scale, there are additional regularity requirements to be able to do that. So in particular, I mean, a sufficient condition is that the moment generating function is complex analytic in the vicinity of lambda equal to 0. Now, this time it's not quite clear why that will be relevant, but I hope to explain this in a few slides, that there is actually a lot of interesting physics there. So to do that, I will again work on this very useful toy model, which is a stochastic model of ballistically propagating particles with plus and minus charge, red and blue. And the particles move freely except when they collide, and then you have stochastic scattering, so they either cross or they bounce back elastically. And of course, the question that I will ask is what are the charge fluctuations of this charge current? So here, let me just first consider this what's called the single file model. So the limit when there is only backscattering, there is no crossing. So the single file property here refers to the fact that the particles are now essentially have a hardcore interaction, so that the order of the particles is preserved in time. And this gives rise to very strong anticorrelations in the current. And so the typical fluctuations here are very strongly non-Gaussian. So now let me explain how this comes about. So what you see here on the left, it's a scheme of a realization of this process. And now you see, let's say you follow this negative particle. It goes here, here, and it bounces. So it crosses here and here. The line where I'm counting the current. Now, because of the single file property, you see these two values would exactly cancel out. And it is only the word lines that are given in bold here that will actually contribute to the current. Now you can essentially reason in two steps. The first is, what is the distribution of the particles that will actually not cancel in the current? And this, I mean, by a simple counting argument, you can show that that is going to be asymptotically Gaussian. And then you're left with doing essentially the color combinatorics on top of these particles. And if red and blue are equally likely, you'll also realize that that is going to be Gaussian, but the variance of that Gaussian is essentially going to be equal to the number of particles. And then you combine these two, and you get this very strongly non-Gaussian distribution. And I mean, this can also be done more precisely, but that's essentially the main idea of how you get the distribution. Now, from the microscopic calculation, there is also another surprising thing, and that is that you find, if you look at the cumulants of the process, they actually scale non-uniformly with time. So higher cumulants grow faster with time. And that's quite surprising, because ordinarily you would expect all the cumulants, if you have a large deviation principle, to grow with equal rates. So that's that. And also, I mean, one, of course, objection here might be that, I mean, this is sort of a very specific model, and I mean, how stable is that? And what you can show is that essentially, as long as you have this single file property, and then you put colors on top, the underlying dynamics of the particles does not really matter very much. I mean, so you can show some stability results that you will see this type of physics quite generically. Okay, so now what about this argument? How is it possible that the fluctuations are non-Gaussians from this regularity condition? And here it's very useful to do what's called a Liang analysis. So what you can do is you can take your moment generating function, and then you can write it as a product of some function that is analytic in a strip of finite width along the real line times polynomial, and then you can factor that polynomial over the zeros, and these are called the Liang zeros. Now, because J is a real quantity, the zeros cannot occur on the real axis, but they occur in the complex plane. And then what you can look at is how these zeros move as time increases. And now, if I call the Liang zero that's closest to the origin the leading Liang zero, what you can show is that if the Liang zero is bounded away from the origin for all time, then your cumulants will all grow with a uniform rate, and you'll have a typical Gaussian fluctuations. But on the other hand, if there is a Liang zero that approaches the origin, then this regularity condition on the moment generating function is violated, and you will have non-uniformly scaling cumulants, and then there is nothing that guarantees that your fluctuations are going to be Gaussian. So this is what happens here. Now, this relation can also be the other way. So in particular, if you find cumulants that are diverging non-uniformly, that means that there is some non-analyticity happening. And this is very useful because it gives you a very convenient numerical check of this critical behavior. Now, so far I've been talking about equilibrium, but now you can also play the same game out of equilibrium. And there you actually find dynamical phase transitions in the rate function, but I will not have time to go into that. But yeah, you can find sort of quite a rich phenomenology of these dynamical phases. Okay, so for hydrodynamics, I mean, most of this you heard yesterday from Gautam, but essentially just in, well, two lines essentially. Here on the right-hand side, you see sort of how this large-scale behavior looks like. And see there is a sort of strong laminar structure, but all the dynamics are essentially driven by the fluctuating number of vacancies crossing. And so if you look at the hydrodynamic equation, you can essentially think of it as all the dynamics is driven, even though the velocity on average is zero, the dynamics are essentially driven by local fluctuations of the velocity. And this is what gives rise to these anomalous fluctuations. So now I'd also briefly like to talk about this stochastic model, where you also allow for stochastic scattering. And here, the way you can solve this is if I order my two-body basis in the following way, essentially the local propagator can be written as a 9x9 matrix. And the fact that vacancies propagate freely, this means that this sort of almost a swap matrix, except in the two-particle sector where you find a stochastic six-vertex model. And then, well, after some fairly simple, after some simplifications, you can write this as essentially a square of this 9x9 vertex model. And then what you can do is you can rewrite these input states, basically write this as the sum of row combinations of the zeros. And then because the zeros propagate freely, you realize that when you have a zero, you can basically just delete the row and column wherever there is a zero. So then what you're left with is you're left with essentially a sum over rectangles whose shape now fluctuates of the stochastic six-vertex model. And then this model is actually bistochastic, so it's a stochastic matrix both horizontally and vertically. And then there is a nice simplification that occurs for such a model, and that is if you look at how the vertex model acts on an arbitrary pair of states, you realize it basically just either swaps them or leaves them invariant. That means that if you do an appropriate rotation of this reduced body, well, of this reduced six-vertex model in an appropriate basis rotation, you can basically just study the combinatorics of the step initial condition, or what's called sometimes the domain wall initial condition. And the price you have to pay for that is that at the end you need to compute some overlaps that come from this rotation, but this can be neatly absorbed in some reduced variable, and this is actually quite well known in this SEP and six-vertex model. Okay, so what I've been telling you, essentially pictorially, is that the moment generating function of the process can be written as some combination of step of the full counting statistics of the stochastic six-vertex model with step initial conditions, and this is where now integral probability comes in, because I mean that is still quite a complicated object. But there was sort of a fundamental, this problem has a long history, but there was fundamental work by Tracy and Widom who showed that the transition probabilities in that model have sort of very natural expressions in terms of Bethe-Ansatz wave functions. And then this was generalized to the stochastic six-vertex model by Borodin, Corwin, and Gorin. And essentially by, I mean, here I'll have to skip all the details, but by studying those works, it was possible to derive a Fred-Hall determinant representation of these full counting statistics. And this, I later learned, this generalizes a result due to Nomura, Malik, and Susamoto on the symmetric simple exclusion. So in particular, if I take the continuous time limit of that by taking gamma to 0 and taking t to infinity, where gamma t is finite, this essentially recovers the dispersion relation of the symmetric simple exclusion. And then once you have that, I mean, you can then, there are techniques to extract the asymptotics of that Fred-Hall determinant. And then once you have that, you can go back to the sum, and then you also take this outer asymptotics, and then you find a sort of very neat result. And that is, there is a one-parameter family of distributions that depend on parameter R that essentially interpolate. So in the single file case, you see you have this very strongly non-Gaussian distribution with a cusp. And this you can think of essentially as a nested center limit theorem. Now, in the case where there is no backscattering, there are no anticorrelations, and just have a center limit theorem. But in between, you essentially have this distribution that interpolates between these two limiting regimes. Okay, and here I should also mention, I mean, as Jacopo mentioned, I mean, the same result you can also get from the hydrodynamic description, and it matches. So now, just very briefly, I mean, to interpret what this parameter R means is, as you heard yesterday, I mean, there are two sources of diffusive scale dynamics in this model. One is normal diffusion, and the other is convective diffusion. And because of linear degeneracy, they can essentially coexist without the model being super diffusive. And this parameter R essentially measures the relative strength of convective compared to normal diffusion. Now, this also gives you some more motivation as to why it's interesting to look at full counting statistics, in that you can compute the structure factor of this model with generic crossing, and you just find it to be Gaussian. So from that, I mean, you might say to, well, this is just normal diffusion, because at the level of the two-point function, there is no way to distinguish these two effects. It's only when you go to the full counting statistics that you see that these are actually two different different processes, and they affect the full counting statistics, but they're additive in the structure factor. Okay, so here now I'll also say a few words how these ideas occur in integrable spin chains. And here I will talk about the XXZ spin chain. I'll always be at half filling at infinite temperature. And numerically, what you find is in the easy axis regime, when delta is greater than 1, and in the isotropic regime, when delta is equal to 1, the spin current fluctuations are very strongly anomalous, because you can look at the cumulants and you see very clearly that the cumulants are actually diverging with different power laws. So that, if you remember what I was saying, this immediately tells you that there is syncreticality. And then, of course, the question is, what are the fluctuations? And they need not be Gaussian, so what are they? This I think I'll skip. So if you just go to the easy axis regime, you find a very interesting observation, and that is the black line here. This is actually the distribution that was derived in the single file limit of the cellular automaton. You find that at long times, the spin current distribution is actually converging to this limit. And you can also, the way to understand this essentially is that in XXZ, in the easy axis regime, there is no normal diffusion, there is essentially only convective diffusion, which is the same process that is in the only source of dynamics in the single file limit. And this essentially drives all the dynamics. And indeed, as Gautam mentioned, we're now, we can actually show this analytically by essentially by propagating initial spin current fluctuations according to this GHD. You can, there are some technical details, but you can essentially work this out and show that this is indeed the case hydrodynamically. And this result also, in the limit of delta to infinity, you can sort of make a kinetic argument as to why this distribution should appear. This was done in this work, and indeed our result confirms this in the specific limit. Okay, so that's that about the easy axis, and now very briefly I want to say something about the Heisenberg point, so the isotropic limit. And there it's been known for quite a long time from various approaches that spin is actually super diffusive at the Heisenberg point. And this super diffusion has even been observed experimentally in neutron scattering experiments and in cold atom experiments. Of course, the dynamical exponent there is 3/2. The dynamical exponent by itself is not enough to really pinpoint what the physics is. And then the next basic question that you can ask is, well, what is the spin structure factor? So you look at the two-point function. And there you find a very curious connection, and that is there seems to be some connection with the KPZ equation, which again we heard about in the last talk. And in particular, there is by now very strong numerical evidence that the asymptotics of the structure factor in the Heisenberg spin chain coincide with the structure factor of the KPZ class. Now, that's a very surprising thing, because there is at the moment no real understanding of why that should occur in the spin chain. And the problem is even more complicated because, okay, so you say at level of two-point functions, I see the KPZ function, or the KPZ scaling function. But then the fluctuations in the KPZ class are also very well known. I mean, they depend somewhat on what exactly are your initial conditions, but this has essentially all been worked out, and they've been observed experimentally in these liquid crystal experiments. And but then if you look at fluctuations, you realize that KPZ cannot be the full answer. You see, the KPZ equation, that is sort of an intrinsically non-equilibrium phenomenon. So in other words, if I take h to minus h, this is not a symmetry of the KPZ equation because of this nonlinearity. But if I look at spin current fluctuations in equilibrium, I mean, having current fluctuations that is positive or negative, that clearly that is equally likely. So that spin current fluctuations in the in equilibrium, those are clearly going to be symmetric. And if you look at it very close numerically, I mean, you find indeed they're symmetric, but there seems to be some very small deviation from Gaussianity. And so, I mean, then there was really a question, I mean, is this really KPZ or not? And then there was work by Takeuchi and collaborators. And essentially, what they looked at the level of two-point functions, not just the structure factor, you can look at essentially at also other predictions of the KPZ, and at level of 2-point functions, everything in the spin chain agrees precisely with what is the prediction of KPZ. So at level of 2-point function, it does seem to be that there is KPZ, but at level of higher point functions, just by this simple symmetry argument, it cannot be fully KPZ. So I mean, this is by now, I mean, there have been some theoretical attempts, but they have all not worked out. So I mean, it will be very interesting to understand really how this type of super diffusion can come about in a spin chain. Now just a very last slide. These things can also have been probed experimentally, in particular by Google Quantum AI. They can implement this sort of integrable spin chain dynamics using superconducting qubits. And so, for example, they can take here they started from a domain wall. So blue and yellow, this is spin up, spin down, and then they run the dynamics, and then they can really just count how many spins cross across this line. And then they can essentially build up the distribution of that. And well, I mean, so here they're showing the kurtosis of this distribution, which, well, I mean, it's an experiment and it's quite noisy, but it does somewhat to qualitatively agree with these numerics in the spin chain. And also, but there is, I mean, so if you look at it, this is essentially some quantum numerics with precisely the same parameters that they used. And what you see, so the purple line here, this is the quantum numerics, and the strong purple, this is the experimental results. And so they're essentially still in this sort of intermediate time regime. So to really sort of settle this experimentally, you need to access much longer times, which at the moment is not experimentally feasible. Okay, so with that, I'd just like to thank the people that I have been working on this, and thank you for your attention.
Questions?
I somehow thought that the Google's result was a negative result in the sense that its higher point function didn't match with KPZ.
Sorry, this result?
No, the Google's one.
No. So I mean, so the result was essentially, there was some theoretical explanation in terms of sort of two coupled hydrodynamic modes. This is this nonlinear fluctuating hydro here.
Oh, I see.
And this did not match with the experimental result. Yeah.
I see. Is higher point functions checked?
Well, I mean, the 2-point functions have been checked numerically extensively, and essentially, I mean, if you want the fluctuation, which you can think of these as sort of specific marginalizations of higher point functions. But I don't think anyone has looked at sort of
why is that? Why is higher point function? I mean, I hear everyone says the higher point. You don't have to check the higher point functions because they're products of 2-point functions. But why is that? Oh, it's not okay.
The product of, I mean, I don't think anyone has looked at, for example, the 4-point function numerically. What I'm saying is, for example, if you look at cumulants, right? Cumulants. I mean, a cumulant, you can sort of write it as you can write this as a marginalization of, I don't know.
Okay.
N, and then you marginalize over n-1 of these variables.
Mm-hmm. I see. So that is information about 2-point functions.
Yeah,
but like, what does it mean when do you know if it matches the KPZ result when you do this XXZ like Heisenberg chain?
Yeah, XXX.
Okay, but what about the Heisenberg, like delta is equal to 1?
No, it's exactly. It is at the delta equal to 1 that you match this KPZ. In particular, if you look at the spin structure function.
But this is just scaling, right? I mean, T is...
No, not the scaling. One is the scaling.
F as well.
Also F, yeah. And F, this is, there is strong numerical evidence that basically F asymptotically goes to the scaling function of KPZ.
But I just said F is a symmetric function and KPZ1 is non-symmetric. What's...
No, so the F, this is the correlation function of the derivative of the height field in KPZ. What is here, here would be the full 1-point function, so the full fluctuations of the height field. And this is asymmetric. This goes into either Baker-Rains, GOE or GUE, depending on your initial conditions.
I guess I was more interested in that next slide, the picture in the next. So is it supposed to be, why do people say that it matches KPZ?
No, this does not match.
This does not match?
This does not match, and this is by simple symmetry argument. It cannot be match KPZ because, I mean, clearly, right, in equilibrium, the probability of having current J and minus J, it has to be...
Right. But why do people say that it's partial KPZ?
Because at the level of two-point functions, again, sort of at the level of the structured function, that everything, you take a two-point function and you compute it in a spin chain, and that matches the prediction of KPZ.
I see. But if people don't think that this at large T is described by KPZ equation.
No, I mean, exactly. So all the spin dynamics cannot be described by KPZ because otherwise also the fluctuations would match.
No, I just have a hard time understanding what this universality class is. I mean, because in equilibrium physics, we have CFT and we know what the universality class is. But when people say KPZ universality, I don't know what that means.
I mean, for example, the KPZ equation at long times lies in the KPZ universality class. And there are other models. I mean, for example, this ASEP at long times, you will essentially match predictions of the KPZ universality class.
But if just two-point functions match, why do we say that it's the same universality?
No, I'm not saying that. And this is not, it is just, I mean, this is
all the relation.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. So just one clarification about, so for the XXZ and XXX cases, so what was the initial condition and where exactly were you counting?
Yeah. So I am looking at infinite temperature states at half filling. So I mean, sort of completely maximum entropy state.
And where exactly is this counting?
You just take the origin of your system because I mean in maximum entropy state, right, it's translation invariant, so it doesn't really matter where you count.
And so basically, like number of spins going from left to right or something like that.
Exactly.
And this is in equilibrium in some sense. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, actually, I had a question. Can you show the plot, the distribution of current? Like you didn't, for the scaling, you didn't need any scaling of the current with like some power, like the data column.
There is this J is rescaled as T to the 1/4.
1/4, and for the isotropic case,
it's 1/3.
1/3. Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes when you see the singularities in the large deviation function or the cumulative generating function, they are associated with sometimes the crossing of largest eigenvalues of matrices. So I saw that you connect to the Youngly zeros. Is there any relation with the crossing of largest eigenvalues of different operators in this problem?
Here I do not see it because the way you get this, there is sort of a combinatorial dressing, you see, because in this single file limit, you can essentially, you first do the combinatorics of the particle crossings. Then there is essentially just another combinatorial dressing of the color combinatorics on top of the particles. Because this charge inertness, I mean, if you look at the dynamics of the particles are completely independent of the charges that you put on top. So, and essentially this critical behavior and also this non-Gaussianity, this comes from essentially this nesting of this combinatorics of the charge on top of the particles. So at the moment, I don't see some connection, some eigenvalue crossing.
Maybe if I could ask a related question. So you said you get the large deviation also through the BMFT.
Yes.
So if there are such singularities comes, then usually in the such hydrodynamics picture, singularities corresponds to again switching off the optimal paths.
Yes.
Okay. So in the BMFT, do you see across the singularity the Euler equation?
So I mean, so here we solved the BMFT equations at the moment only in equilibrium. We did not do the full out of equilibrium solution. So I can compute the rate function out of equilibrium using the microscopic calculations. This is known, but the BMFT equations out of equilibrium for this model have not been solved. We only solved them in equilibrium. where the solution is simpler.
Okay, I think we can have other questions during lunch. So let's thank Žiga for a great talk.